The wind had been turning mean for 3 days. It came off the flatlands with nothing to break it, a bitter, scouring thing that stripped the last stubborn leaves from the skeletal branches of the cottonwood and drove dust into the cracks of Alara's cabin until the air inside tasted of grit and distance. She had lived with that taste for so long it had become a flavor of solitude itself, like the metallic tang of well water or the smoky whisper of the hearth. For 10 years, the cabin had been a shell she carried on her back, a place not of living, but of waiting. Waiting for the seasons to turn, for the silence to deepen, for a final, quiet settling. She was moving a log into the fire, her knuckles white and chapped, when the sound came. It was not the wind, which moaned a constant, low grief around the eaves. This was sharper, a thin, desperate cry swallowed almost immediately by the gale. She froze, her hand hovering over the flames, the heat a dry caress on her skin. She was a woman who had learned to distrust her own senses. The plains could play tricks, throwing voices on the wind, making shadows dance like men in the long dusk. Grief was a ghost that could mimic any sound it chose. But then it came again, closer this time. A human sound, a fragile thread of misery against the vast, frayed blanket of the storm. Alara straightened, her body a column of stiff resistance. She wiped her hands on her coarse wool skirt and walked to the door, her boots making no sound on the worn floorboards she knew better than her own face. The door was her shield, made of thick, weathered pine, barred by a heavy beam of oak. No one came to this place. The track leading to it was more memory than road, and the nearest town, a huddle of false fronts and suspicion, kept its distance. She was a splinter the world had forgotten to pull. She pressed her ear to the wood. The wind howled, a physical blow against the cabin. Underneath it, closer now, was the unmistakable sound of a baby crying. A raw, piercing wail that scraped at something deep inside her, a place she had boarded up and covered with dust. She did not want to open the door. The world outside of her small, controlled silence was a place of pain and taking. It had taken everything from her once before, and she had no more to give. But the cry was relentless. It was not a sound one could ignore, like a coyote or a hawk. It was the sound of life clinging to a ledge. Section with a slow, grudging breath, she lifted the bar. The wood groaned in protest. The wind caught the door and tore it from her grip, slamming it open against the cabin wall. Cold and dust and the smell of rain-soaked earth rushed in, extinguishing the weak flame of her lantern and sending embers scattering from the hearth. And in the churning gray of the twilight stood a man. He was little more than a silhouette, thin as a fence rail, stooped against the wind's assault. But it was not him that held her gaze. It was the bundle clutched to his chest, a swaddle of rags from which the crying came. He took one stumbling step forward, into the sliver of firelight that remained, and his face became clear. It was a young face, hollowed out by exhaustion and fear, his eyes wide and dark in the pale landscape of his skin. His lips were cracked and blue with cold. He tried to speak, but the wind stole his words. He shielded the bundle with his own body, turning his back to the worst of the gale. The baby's cries grew weaker, dissolving into hiccuping gasps. Alara stood motionless in the doorway, a ghost in her own home. The cold air clung to her like wet paper. She saw the desperation in him, a wild, cornered thing. She saw the fine tremor in his hands, the way his worn coat, no match for this weather, was soaked through. He found his voice, a rasp that was barely audible. "Please," he said. The word was a piece of him, broken off and offered. He took another step, then another, until he was just inside the threshold, out of the direct assault of the wind. The firelight caught the fine dusting of snow on his shoulders. Just for the night, his eyes did not beg. They stated a fact, a final, terrible truth. He had nowhere else to go. She looked from his haunted face to the small, squirming bundle. The crying had stopped, replaced by a faint, fretful mewing. She could see a tiny, clenched fist, no bigger than a walnut, peeking from the rags. Her first instinct, the one honed by a decade of self-preservation, was to say no. to close the door and bar it and let the storm have them. It was not her burden. She had carried her own burdens until her back had bowed, and she had set them down here, in this quiet, empty place. She had no room for the burdens of others. But her body moved before her mind could protest. She stepped back, away from the door, a silent, grudging invitation. He hesitated, as if not quite believing it, then stumbled fully inside. Alara pushed against the wind, her shoulder pressed to the heavy pine, and with a great heave, forced the door shut. The bar fell back into its cradle with a solid, definitive thud. The sudden silence was immense. The roar of the wind was now a muffled howl. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the man's ragged breathing, and the soft, whimpering noises from the bundle in his arms. He stood there, dripping on her floor, looking lost and broken in the warm, dim light. He carried whole winters in his eyes. She did not speak. Words were for bargains and betrayals. Instead, she pointed a finger toward the hearth. He understood. He moved toward the fire with the slow, shuffling gait of a man who had walked past the edge of his own strength. He sank down onto the rough stone of the hearth, his back to the wall, and finally, carefully, began to unwrap the bundle. A small, pinched face was revealed, red and raw from the cold and the crying. A few strands of dark hair were plastered to its scalp. The baby, a girl by the look of her, let out a weak cry, a protest against the sudden change in temperature. The man fumbled with the rags, his fingers stiff and clumsy. Alara turned away. She went to the dry sink, poured a measure of water from her bucket into the cast-iron kettle, and hung it on the hook over the fire. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice and deep weariness. She scooped oats into a wooden bowl. She did not look at him, did not acknowledge the profound intrusion of his presence. She simply did the next thing that needed doing. The water began to steam. He was trying to warm the baby's feet in his hands, rubbing them gently, his head bowed low over her. His focus was so absolute it seemed to carve out a separate space around them, a small island of desperate tenderness in the ocean of her quiet room. When the water was hot, Alara took it from the fire. She mixed it with the oats, stirring until it made a thin, watery gruel. She took the bowl and a spoon and walked over to the hearth. She did not look at him. She looked at the child. She knelt, the rough floorboards pressing into her knees, and held out the bowl. He looked up, his eyes filled with a dazed sort of gratitude. She won't, he started, his voice a dry whisper. Alara dipped the very tip of the spoon into the gruel and brought it to the baby's lips. The baby turned her head away, her mouth a tight line. Alara waited. The patience was something she had learned from the land itself, from watching seeds that failed to sprout, from waiting for rains that never came. She touched the spoon to the baby's lips again. This time, a tiny pink tongue darted out, testing. Then the mouth opened, just a crack. She fed the child, spoonful by careful spoonful. The man watched, his shoulders slumped in relief. The tension seemed to drain out of him, leaving him looking even thinner, as if his fear had been the only thing holding him together. When the bowl was empty, the baby's eyes were closed, her breathing slow and even. She was asleep. Alara stood up and went to the large wooden chest at the foot of her bed. From it, she pulled a thick wool blanket, old but clean, smelling of cedar and disuse. She brought it back and laid it on the floor by the fire, a few feet from where the man sat. She did not offer it to him. She laid it out as a designated space. A bed. A boundary. Then she took her own thin blanket from her cot, went back to the hearth, and gently, so gently, lifted the sleeping child from her father's arms. The man did not resist. He let her go, his hands falling empty to his lap. Alara wrapped the infant in her own warm, dry blanket and laid her down on the makeshift bed near the fire's warmth. She placed a log beside the pallet to keep her from rolling too close to the flames. The task was done. She had offered shelter. She had offered food. She had offered warmth. It was more than she had offered anyone in a decade. She felt emptied by it, scraped clean. She retreated to her cot in the far, cold corner of the room, pulled her threadbare shawl around her shoulders and sat down. She did not lie down. She would not sleep. She would watch. The man had not moved. He just stared into the fire, his face a mask of light and shadow. The silence in the room stretched and settled, heavy as a shroud. Outside, the wind still raged, but inside, for the first time in a very long time, the cabin held the soft, rhythmic sound of another's breath. It was the sound of a life she had, for a single night, allowed to intersect with her own. The night passed in a series of quiet tableaus. The fire burned down to glowing embers, and the man, his head finally slumped against the stone of the hearth, slept a sleep so deep it looked like a small death. Twice, the baby stirred and whimpered, and twice, Alara rose from her cot before the sound could wake him. She moved like a shadow, her bare feet silent on the floor. She checked the child's warmth, adjusted the blanket, and sat on the floor beside her until the fretful noises subsided into the deep, even cadence of sleep. She did not touch the child more than was necessary. It was a duty, not an indulgence. When the first hint of gray light seeped through the cracks in the shutters, she was already up, rekindling the fire. The storm had broken. The wind had quieted to a low, mournful sigh. She made coffee, boiling the grounds in a pot until the cabin filled with the bitter, earthy scent. The man stirred when she set a tin cup of the steaming black liquid on the hearthstone near his hand. He woke with a jolt, his eyes flying open in a panic, searching for the child. He saw her, safe and sleeping by the embers, and the fear receded, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. He looked at the cup, then at Alara, who stood by the fire, her back to him. "Thank you," he said. His voice was stronger this morning, less of a rasp. She gave a short, sharp nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, not welcome. The bargain was for one night. The night was over. He drank the coffee, cradling the hot tin in his hands. He watched her as she moved about the small cabin, slicing bread from a dense, dark loaf. She put 2 slices on a plate, along with a small piece of hard cheese, and set it on the small, scarred table. An offering, a dismissal. He ate slowly, methodically, as if reminding his body how. He looked around the cabin. It was stark, bare, but immaculately clean. There were no pictures on the walls, no trinkets on the mantel, no sign of any life lived here beyond the bare necessities of survival. A cot, a table, 2 chairs, a chest. A room scrubbed clean of memories. On the mantelpiece sat a single object. A small, smooth, white stone, the kind one finds in a riverbed. He finished the bread and stood up, his joints stiff. He walked over to the pallet where the baby slept and knelt beside her. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he began to gather the damp, stiff rags he had used as swaddling. Alara watched him from the corner of her eye. She saw the resolve in the set of his shoulders. He was preparing to leave. He would wrap the child in those miserable rags and step back out into the cold, gray world. Her part was done. He had the baby bundled again, a clumsy package of cloth and life. He stood, holding the child to his chest, and turned to face her. The light from the single window caught the angles of his face. He was younger than she had first thought. Not a boy, but not yet a man hardened by years of bitterness. His eyes were clear, and they held hers. "I have nothing to pay you with," he said. It was a simple statement of fact. "I asked for nothing," she replied, her voice flat. He nodded. "I know," he hesitated, shifting the baby in his arms. "The town. They said you didn't take kindly to strangers. The town says many things." Her tone was curt, cutting off the conversation. He looked down at the child, then back at her. A silent battle was being waged behind his eyes. "My name is Elias," he said, as if the offering of a name was a form of currency. "And this is Sparrow." Alara's expression did not change, but something inside her flickered. Sparrow. A name for something small and brown and easily broken, a thing that could be swept away by the wind. "We'll be on our way," Elias said, taking a step toward the door. She watched him. She saw the threadbare coat, the worn-out boots. She heard the low sigh of the wind outside, a promise of more cold to come. The baby was silent. But for how long? Out there, on the open plains, a baby's cry was a dinner bell for wolves and a death knell for a man on foot. She thought of the journey he must have already made, the miles he must have crossed to end up at her door, the very last door on the edge of nowhere. Her mind, the cold, practical part of her that had kept her alive, told her to let him go. But the image of the small, clenched fist, the memory of the weak, hungry cry, had lodged itself in her like a burr. He had his hand on the bar of the door. "The bread I gave you," she said, her voice sharp. "It's not enough for a day's walk." He stopped, his hand frozen on the wood. He turned back to her, his expression a mixture of confusion and a faint, desperate hope. "The woodpile is low," she said, looking past him at the stack of logs by the hearth. "And the fence by the creek needs mending where the last snow brought down a branch." It was not an invitation. It was a statement of fact, a list of work that needed doing. Understanding dawned slowly in his eyes. He was not being offered charity. He was being offered a transaction. Labor for shelter. It was a language he understood. It was a way for him to keep his pride, a thing he seemed to be carrying with as much care as the child. "I can chop wood," he said, his voice steady. Alara gave another one of her short, sharp nods. She turned her back on him and began to wash the few dishes from their meager breakfast. The unspoken contract was extended. Not for a night, but for a day. One day at a time. It was the only way she knew how to live. A new rhythm established itself, quiet and unforced. It was a rhythm of work. Elias was a hard worker, methodical and tireless. He swung the axe with a steady, metronomic beat that became a new sound in Alara's world, a counterpoint to the wind and the silence. He stacked the wood in a neat, tight cord against the cabin wall. He did not speak unless spoken to, and she rarely spoke. She, in turn, found her days subtly altered. The presence of the baby was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of her own routines. The cabin, once a space of pure emptiness, was now punctuated by small, living sounds. A soft coo, a sudden cry, the gentle rustle of a sleeping infant. Alara found herself listening for them, her body tensing at a cry of distress, a strange, unfamiliar softness unfurling in her chest at a sound of contentment. She showed him, without words, how to make a warm mash of goat's milk and boiled root vegetables for Sparrow. She watched as he fed the child, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle. He would talk to the baby in a low murmur, a stream of soft nonsense words that seemed to soothe them both. One afternoon, while he was out mending the fence, Alara found a small box of her husband's things, a box she had not opened in 10 years. From it, she took a tiny pair of woolen socks, yellowed with age, and a soft flannel shirt. She washed them and laid them by the fire to dry. When Elias came in that evening, cold and weary, he saw the small garments. He looked at them, then at her, a question in his eyes. She was stirring a pot of stew, her face impassive. She said nothing. He said nothing. But later, when he dressed Sparrow for sleep, he put her in the warm flannel and the tiny socks. Days bled into a week, then 2. The fence was mended. The woodpile was high. Elias began to look for other work. He rechinked the walls of the cabin with fresh mud and straw. He repaired the hinge on the cellar door. He moved with a quiet purpose, making himself useful, earning his keep. He was stitching his life, and his daughter's, into the fabric of her solitude. He began to look less haunted. The hollows in his cheeks filled out. The constant, hunted look in his eyes was replaced by a watchful calm. He still never spoke of where he had come from or what he was running from. The past was a locked room between them, and neither of them had the key. Alara found herself watching him. She watched his hands as he carved a small, smooth bird out of a piece of scrap wood for Sparrow. She watched the way his shoulders relaxed when he held the baby, the way he would press his cheek to the top of her head. She saw not a fugitive, but a father. One evening, a hard frost had settled over the land, painting the single window pane with intricate, fern-like patterns. The fire was burning bright. Sparrow was asleep on her pallet. Elias sat on the floor, polishing the blade of the axe with an oiled rag. Alara was darning one of his socks, the rough wool coarse against her fingers. The silence in the room was comfortable now, a shared blanket rather than an empty space. "The man who lived here," Elias said, his voice low, not looking at her. "He built this place strong." Alara's needle paused mid-stitch. It was the first time he had ever acknowledged the ghost in the room. "He did," she said, her voice tight. "There's a grave," Elias continued, his eyes still on the axe blade. "Out past the cottonwood. Just 1 inch. I know." He finally looked up, his gaze direct and steady. "My wife. She died when Sparrow was born. Her father, he's a hard man. A man who believes everything is his to own. He blamed me. He said the baby was his. Blood of his blood. Property." The word hung in the air between them. Property. Alara knew that word. She had been seen as little more than that herself, after her husband died. Piece of land. A cabin. An asset to be absorbed. "He has men," Elias said, his voice barely a whisper. "They would have taken her. Couldn't let them. I ran." He had offered her his story, a piece of his past, raw and bleeding. It was a gift of immense trust. Alara looked down at the sock in her hands. The needle had pricked her finger. A single, perfect drop of blood welled up, bright crimson against her pale skin. "My husband, Thomas?" she said, the name feeling strange on her tongue after so many years of silence. "He built this place for us. For the child we were to have." She paused, the memory a physical ache in her throat. "There was a fever that winter. Took them both. The baby was born sleeping." She looked up and met his eyes. She saw her own grief reflected there. A different shape, a different story, but the same hollow echo. For the first time, she was not just a provider of shelter, and he was not just a recipient of charity. They were two people, sitting by a fire, sharing the weight of the lives they had lost. "I am sorry," he said, and the words were simple and true. "I am sorry for your wife," she replied, her voice thick. The silence that followed was different. It was not empty. It was filled with the things they had finally said. The fire crackled, spitting a spark onto the hearth. Alara went back to her darning, her stitches small and even. Elias went back to polishing the axe. But something fundamental had shifted. The walls of the cabin seemed to have expanded, making room for two sorrows instead of one. They were no longer just a woman and a man and a baby. They were becoming something else, something that did not yet have a name. The slow thaw continued. It was in the way he started leaving a cup of hot coffee on the table for her in the mornings, not just on the hearth. It was in the way she started humming, a low, tuneless sound, as she kneaded bread. It was a sound she had not made in years. One afternoon, a traveler on the main road, miles away, must have spoken of them. The harbinger came in the form of the town's sheriff, a man named Miller, whose face was a map of weary compromise. He rode up to the cabin, his horse kicking up dust that settled like a fine powder on Alara's porch. She met him at the door, blocking the entrance. Elias had seen him coming and had melted into the trees behind the cabin, the axe in his hand, Sparrow held tight to his chest. "Alara," Miller said, tipping his hat. He didn't dismount. "Been a while." "It has," she said. "Heard you had company." His eyes scanned the cabin, the neatly stacked woodpile, the mended fence. "Heard a man and a baby turned up. I have a hired hand," she said, her voice cold and even as river stone. The work was too much for one. Miller shifted in his saddle. "Folks are talking." A man from up north passed through, asking questions. A rich man, by the name of Blackwood, looking for his son-in-law and his granddaughter. Alara's face remained a stony mask, but her heart began to beat a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. I don't know any man by that name. This Blackwood, Miller continued, ignoring her denial, is offering a reward, a substantial one, for the return of the child. He says the father is unstable. A danger. The man I hired is a good worker, Alara said. He keeps to himself. He's no danger to anyone. Miller sighed, a long, tired sound. He looked at her, his gaze holding a measure of grudging respect and something like a warning. Be careful, Alara. Silas Blackwood is not a man to cross. He has the law on his side, or at least the kind of law that money can buy. He sees the child as his property. He will come for her. He turned his horse and rode away, leaving his words hanging in the air like dust. When Elias returned, his face was pale. He had heard it all. The fear was back in his eyes, the hunted look she had first seen. I have to leave, he said, his voice tight with panic. I've brought his trouble to your door. And go where? She asked, her voice sharp. Back out into the wind? With him knowing you're in this territory? You won't last a day. I can't let him find us here. I can't let him bring his fight to you. This is my land, she said, and her voice held a note of steel he had never heard before. She looked from his frightened face to the small child in his arms, who was staring up at her with wide, curious eyes. He is not the first man who thinks he can take what he wants from this place. He will not be the last. She walked past him into the cabin. You are my hired hand, she said over her shoulder. And a hired hand's work is not yet done. It was not a plea for him to stay. It was a command. It was an anchor. He stood there for a long moment, the setting sun casting his long shadow across the yard. Then he followed her inside and barred the door. The time for running was over. The time for waiting had begun. They waited. The days that followed were taut with a new kind of tension. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow on the horizon looked like a rider. They worked, but there was a feverish edge to their movements. Elias sharpened the axe until the blade gleamed. Alara cleaned and oiled the old hunting rifle of her husband's that had sat above the mantel for a decade, untouched. Her movements were steady, practiced. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, the rifle leaning against the wall beside her, the axe beside him. They were a silent army of two. The cabin was no longer a shelter. It was a fortress. One night, Sparrow was fussing, a low, teething cry that frayed the edges of the silence. Elias walked her back and forth, his face etched with worry. Alara watched them. Then she stood up and walked to the small grave beyond the cottonwood tree. It was something she never did. The grave was marked by a simple wooden cross, weathered and gray. She knelt and pulled the few weeds that had dared to grow there. She straightened the pile of stones at its base. Then she spoke to the earth, her voice a low whisper carried away by the wind. Thomas, she said, I'm sorry, but the house is not empty anymore. The threat, when it came, did not arrive with the subtlety of a sheriff. It came as three riders, dark shapes against the blood orange of the dawn sky. They did not follow the track but cut straight across the plains, their intent clear. At their head was a man whose expensive coat and arrogant posture marked him as different from the hired guns who flanked him. Silas Blackwood. Alara saw them first. She was drawing water from the well. She set the bucket down with a soft thud and walked back to the cabin, her stride unhurried. They're here, she said, her voice calm. Elias, who had been feeding Sparrow, went rigid. He handed the baby to Alara. Stay inside. Lock the door, he said, his hand reaching for the axe. No, she said, holding the baby tight. She picked up the rifle from its place by the door. This is my land. The fight happens on my porch. She handed Sparrow back to him. Take her to the cellar. Bar it from the inside. Do not come out. No matter what you hear, his eyes pleaded with her, but her expression was unyielding granite. He hesitated, then did as he was told, disappearing down the trapdoor in the floor, the heavy bar thudding into place. Alara stepped out onto the porch, the rifle held loosely in her hands. She did not raise it. She just stood there, waiting, a lone woman framed in the doorway of her home. Blackwood and his men reined in their horses a few yards from the porch. The animals were restless, their breath pluming in the cold morning air. Blackwood's face was florid, his eyes small and hard. He looked at Alara with disdain, dismissing her as a minor obstacle. "I'm looking for a thief," he said, his voice loud and imperious. "A man named Elias. He stole something that belongs to me. I'm told he's here." "There's no one here by that name," Alara said, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I have a hired hand. That is all." Blackwood sneered. "I have no time for games, old woman. I know he's in there, and he has my granddaughter. Send him out. Send them both out, and I'll leave you to your hovel." "What's in my house is my business," Alara said. "This is my property. You are trespassing. Leave." One of the hired guns chuckled. Blackwood's face darkened with rage. "That child is my blood. She is my property. Give her to me now." He made a motion to dismount. "I said leave," Alara repeated, and this time, she raised the rifle, settling the stock against her shoulder. The movement was fluid, without tremor or hesitation. The barrel pointed squarely at Blackwood's chest. His men reached for their pistols, but Blackwood held up a hand, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. "You'd shoot me? For him? For a worthless, thieving coward?" "I will shoot anyone who tries to take what is mine," she said. "And anyone who tries to take a child from her father." A floorboard creaked behind her. The cellar door had lifted. Elias stood there, his face pale but resolute. He held the axe in one hand. He had not stayed hidden. He stepped out onto the porch to stand beside her. He did not look at Blackwood. He looked at Alara, a quick, grateful glance. Then he faced his father-in-law. "Her name is Sparrow," Elias said, his voice clear and strong. "She is not property. She is my daughter. And you will not take her." Blackwood's face contorted in a mask of fury. "You defy me? Both of you." He looked from Alara's rifle to Elias's axe. He looked at their faces, a woman who had nothing left to lose and a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. They were not scared. They were rooted to that spot, immovable as the land itself. He looked at his hired men. They were paid to intimidate farmers and chase runaways, not to ride into the barrels of a rifle held by a woman with dead eyes and a steady hand. He saw the flicker of doubt in them. He had misjudged this. He had expected a frightened boy and a lonely old woman. He had found a fortress. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice thick with venom. He pulled hard on his reins, turning his horse so sharply it reared. "The law will see me right. The law doesn't ride this far out," Alara said, her voice as cold and flat as the plains in winter. Blackwood stared at her for a long, hate-filled moment. Then, with a curse, he spurred his horse and galloped away, his men following close behind, leaving only the churned-up dust of their retreat. Alara did not lower the rifle until they were specks on the horizon. Then her arms began to tremble, and the weight of the gun seemed immense. She lowered it slowly, leaning it against the wall. Elias let the axe head fall to the porch with a heavy thud. He looked at her, his eyes shining with a fierce, bright emotion. "You didn't run," he said, his voice thick with awe. "This is my home," she whispered, as if to remind herself. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the man he had become in her small cabin. Strong, brave, a father. He took a step toward her, then stopped. The air between them was charged, electric. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. In that silent, shared victory on the porch, a new foundation had been laid. She nodded once, a gesture that was both an acknowledgement and an acceptance. Then she turned and walked back into the cabin, which no longer felt empty, but full of warmth and light and the quiet promise of a future she had never dared to imagine. The house, like her heart, breathed again. The seasons turned. Winter came, blanketing the plains in a deep, silent white. The cabin became a small island of warmth and light in the vast emptiness. Silas Blackwood never returned. The law never came. The world, it seemed, had forgotten them again, but this time the forgetting was a blessing. The rhythm of their lives deepened, became more intricate. It was in the shared meals, the easy silence, the way he would pass her the mending basket without being asked, the way she would leave a warm blanket on the chair he favored by the fire. Love was not a word they used. It was a language they spoke in 1,000 small, quiet actions. It was in the way he chopped wood, the way she baked bread, the way they both watched Sparrow take her first stumbling steps across the worn floorboards. One spring evening, as the last of the snows melted and the air smelled of damp earth and new life, the circuit preacher came by, a rare visitor making his rounds. He was a kind man with gentle eyes. He shared their supper of rabbit stew and fresh bread. He looked at Alara, and at Elias, and at the small child babbling happily on the floor. He saw what they had become. "The Lord works in ways we don't always understand," he said softly. "He can make a family from the most unlikely wood." Later, as he was leaving, he turned to Alara. "It is good to see life in this house again, Alara. It is good to see you." She just nodded, but for the first time in over a decade, a smile touched the corners of her mouth. A small, fragile thing, like the first crocus pushing through the snow. After he left, Elias came to her as she stood by the window, watching the stars prick the deep velvet of the sky. Sparrow was asleep, her breathing a soft whisper in the quiet room. "Alara," he said. He took her hand. His was warm and calloused, hers was small and strong. It was the first time he had ever touched her with such open, deliberate tenderness. Will you let us stay?" It was not a question about the next day or the next week. It was a question about forever. She turned from the window to face him. She looked at his earnest, open face, at the home they had built together from the ashes of their separate griefs. She looked at the small, sleeping child who had been the spark. "Elias," she said, her voice soft but clear, "you are already home. This story, it isn't just about a woman giving a stranger a place to stay. It's about how the emptiest places, inside us and out on the plains, are sometimes just waiting for the right person to come along and ask for a little warmth. It's about how we build a home not with wood and nails, but with shared silence, with quiet acts of courage, with the slow, steady work of earning trust. We all have our own winters, our own desolate landscapes we learn to survive in. We build walls and bar the doors, thinking we're keeping the danger out, but most of the time we're just locking the loneliness in. And we forget that a single, flickering candle doesn't lose its flame by lighting another. It only makes the room brighter. So maybe the bravest thing you can ever do is answer the knock on the door, especially when the wind is howling. Maybe the most important work is not mending fences, but mending the broken pieces of another person's life, and finding, to your surprise, that they fit perfectly against your own. If you're brave enough to offer a stranger